Hello, this is Miss Phillips. I'm the subject lead of the History and Politics, and I've obviously put this session together for you just to kind of give you a feel what sort of discussions we have in politics and the sort of work that you would then be completing should you choose A-level politics. So firstly, thank you very much obviously for taking the time to access this session and obviously for taking an interest in politics. I'll put my email address on one of the later slides towards the end. So if you do have any further questions, please do feel free to email me your questions. A key part of studying politics is keeping up to date with the news. So if you can just take a moment, maybe just pause the PowerPoint to think about what has been happening in the news recently. Some of the pictures there on the screen might obviously prompt you to think about what's been happening in the news, and then kind of start thinking about which of these stories are political news stories. So starting to really think about defining what do we mean by politics, and essentially that's what we'll be focusing on in this session. Your final A-level grade is made up of these 3 exam papers, obviously sat under exam conditions at the end of your 2-year study, so that'll be at the end of year 13. They will each make up, so they're made of equal weighting, so each paper would be worth 33.3% of your overall A-level grade. There isn't any coursework in A-level politics. So paper 1 is on UK politics and the core ideologies. Our core ideologies obviously being conservatism, socialism and liberalism. Paper 2 is then obviously looking at UK government and then obviously a non-core ideology. So this is an additional political idea that we choose to study, and obviously you will study nationalism. On paper 3, you then study comparative theories. So we compare the UK's political system to the political system in the United States. So everything that you've learnt on paper 1 and paper 2, you'll then learn that in the American system, and then we start to look at the comparative theories of obviously how similar, how different these two systems are. So in this session, we want to start thinking about what is politics? What do we mean by the study of politics? And I think a really good place to start to help us understand this definition is thinking about this idea of conflict. So on the screen there, you should be able to see, obviously, you've got 2 images there of Labour leaders. The first one is obviously Jeremy Corbyn, who is no longer the Labour leader, and obviously you've got Keir Starmer, who is. And obviously on the right hand side there, you've got an image of Boris Johnson, who is obviously the leader of the Conservative Party, and obviously our current Prime Minister. And if we want to think about perhaps what these two political parties then represent, so for Labour, perhaps representing for the many, not the few. That's obviously one of Jeremy Corbyn's sort of election sort of campaign slogans, and obviously Keir Starmer now picking up and following on from that, looking at sort of quite similar policies. And then obviously we've got the Conservatives, let's get Brexit done, thinking about obviously leaving the European Union, and perhaps as well sort of trying to deal with the current coronavirus pandemic. So if we want to think about the conflict, obviously we could be referring to the different interests that these political parties might have, the different values or ideologies. So for example, Labour obviously represents sort of socialist ideas, and then obviously Boris Johnson and the Conservatives representing conservative ideas. And again, we start to see conflict, a difference in opinion on the key decisions that are made in this country. Again, obviously there are different approaches, so perhaps different policies, different outcomes that they might disagree or agree about. And again, think about like the scarcity of resources. And again, we can think about in the current coronavirus pandemic, obviously the scarcity of a vaccine, and then thinking about prioritising who should have that vaccine first. The scarcity of PPE, so the protective clothing, so essential for frontline NHS workers. And again, starting to think about the key decisions, the processes that are put in place in our government. So politics essentially, even though there is this conflict, politics itself is about resolving these conflicts without obviously going to war. Politics can also be seen as like the study of power. So we've thought about obviously in terms of conflict, but we can also think of it in terms of who holds power. So if we look at the speech bubbles and the individuals on the screen there, obviously the person on the left is saying obviously we can make him do what I want, and then obviously that is an example of power, especially if that person really didn't want to do it. For power to be effective, obviously there has to be some way of enforcing it. Obviously this can be achieved by the use of force or the threat of force, but again obviously in terms of politics we don't necessarily see that coming through in our system. So actually when we think about how our government have power and exercise that power, it's because we as the people who obviously elect our representatives in government accept it to be legitimate and therefore are willing to obey the government and its laws, because obviously again they've been they are our elected representatives, and we accept obviously that they then hold that legitimate power. And then obviously to hold this legitimate power is then to have authority, and obviously with that authority then come these key decisions, these key changes, and then we as people then obviously accept those changes. Again, if you want to think about this next key concept we've just obviously mentioned about authority, authority is then obviously the right to wield power or the right to make something happen. And again, obviously somebody will do what they have told because that individual might have, or that group might have then authority, and obviously he has authority. I believe he has the right to tell me what to do. So authority can exist without power. And again, you can kind of maybe think thinking outside of politics, you can kind of think about maybe how much authority that your parents or your teachers have. Obviously, they have the authority to tell you what to do, but don't necessarily maybe have the power to tell you what to do. So there are all sorts of ways that we can engage and become involved in politics. So if you just want to pause the PowerPoint for a moment and maybe just jot down a list of all the different ways you think people can engage in politics. Okay, hopefully that's been long enough for you to, hopefully obviously you've had a chance then to pause the PowerPoint and to write down obviously some ideas. Obviously I'll pop some here up on the PowerPoint and talk through just a few of those. And there's lots obviously of different ways of becoming involved in politics, and even some of those conversations, maybe some family decisions that happen at home can also be viewed as political activity. Obviously one of the key ways, and obviously we engage in politics, is obviously in terms of voting. So obviously those over the age of 18 at present, obviously turning out on election day to vote for their local representative to then obviously speak up for their views in London in Parliament. However, there are lots of other ways as well that people can actually engage in politics, obviously writing to an MP, writing to a Member of Parliament, particularly about perhaps some local issues. And again, they can then take that to Parliament, and obviously through sort of Prime Minister's questions that happens every week, might have the opportunity to then obviously to discuss those with people in Parliament. Equally, on the back of obviously voting, refusing to vote is also political activity. It's obviously our democratic right to choose not to vote for a particular individual. You could also then join a political party, and obviously political parties all have, there's different groups within the political parties, and obviously they have sort of youth groups as well. Equally, you can join a pressure group. So if you didn't feel there was a political party that represented all of your views, and there was only a particular specific issue that you felt was really important, then obviously there are groups, political groups that we call pressure groups, that exist in society. Obviously, you can lobby an MEP, so a member of the European Parliament. Obviously, that is now subject to change, obviously, with us leaving the European Union. But again, obviously, there's lots of different ways in which obviously we can engage in political activity, as well as obviously keeping up to date with the news, engaging in obviously online petitions, perhaps these e-petitions, and again, obviously, just even something simple such as like liking a particular post on Facebook or retweeting something on Twitter can again be ways of engaging in politics. So if we want to now kind of think about defining what do we mean by politics, all of these key concepts, all of these sort of key ideas are central to the construction of this definition of politics. So we can argue that obviously through coercion, there is the use or the threat of use of power. Again, think about how this could be both positive and negative. We then have this idea of influence, so obviously politics as perhaps this tool of persuasion. So again, obviously we think about this, particularly when we study pressure groups and the influence on the media, how much influence, how much persuasion do they have on some of our individual decisions. We can also think about the use of law, because obviously that helps keep society regulated and reduce conflict. And then equally on the back of that, we have this idea of justice. And this is supposed to make sure that all power, authority, coercion and influence and the laws that we have that govern us and politics are all exercised in ways that are just and morally right. So to help you in obviously understanding this definition, and it would be worth maybe just writing down obviously what you now feel politics means. What does politics perhaps mean to you? To help you with that decision or with that that summary, with that definition, I'm going to give you some other ideas of other individuals of what they think politics means. So Bernard Crick, for example, argues that politics is the peaceful resolution of conflict. We have Michael Oakeshott, who argues that politics is the organisation of the running of the state. We have Williams, who argues that politics is about conflict. And then we have Roberts, who argues the study of conflict resolution. So again, you may be in writing that definition of what do you feel politics means, you maybe want to include some of these key ideas. So now that we've understood obviously what we mean by politics, obviously thinking about political activity, and this is now really essentially some of the topic content that we would cover in A-level politics. And again, just to give you sort of that taster, that feel for the type of work that we do in preparation then obviously for those A-level exam papers. So if we take voting in the United Kingdom as our case study, as our example for the rest of this session. So in the UK, you are legally allowed to vote if you have registered to vote. That's very important. You have to be registered before turning out to your polling station on election day. You also have to be aged over 18, and we'll have a look at that age limit in just a moment. You can also vote in the UK then obviously if you have met, obviously that you have registered, you're over 18, and that you are a British, Irish or Commonwealth citizen. And you also need to be a resident at an address in the UK, or if you're a British citizen living abroad, you need to be registered to vote in the UK within the last 15 years and also have not been legally excluded from voting in the past. It's normally within sort of 5 years, so you haven't basically committed electoral fraud in the past. So again, just thinking about how does obviously that voting process work on election day. If you would click on the YouTube link and then just watch the video, that will then obviously explain that voting process to you. It should only be a couple of minutes long. So there are lots of debates within politics, and one of these debates is whether or not we should be reducing the current voting age. So it's been reduced down to 18 years old since 1969, and that was changed by the Representation of the People's Act, and it has been at 18 years old since that came into law. We have seen the right to vote restricted historically in this country. And again, we could kind of think about like the evolution of politics and how that has obviously developed over time to our current political system. So previously, votes were actually restricted by gender, and actually even by people's backgrounds, and how much money or land people owned. So actually, women didn't have the right to vote until, or some women had the right to vote from 1918, and then not all women until 1928. So you might have maybe recall, obviously, the suffragettes and their campaigns to reduce, or to encourage the government to allow women the right to vote. And actually, in 1918, as well as obviously women over the age of 30 being allowed the right to vote, men who didn't own property were then extended the right to vote as well. So actually 1918 allows lots more people in the United Kingdom that right to turn out on election day. And then again in 1928, then obviously women over the age of 21 were then extended the right to vote, finally 10 years after the first change. So if we want to think of this politically in context today, there are further calls to extend the right to vote. And actually, people are arguing that we should be, or some people are arguing that we should be giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. So what I would like you to do is, thinking about this debate, is think about whether or not 16 and 17-year-olds, so perhaps individuals around your age, should be allowed to vote. So if you could open the PDF handout with the article that goes through some key debates on reasons why perhaps we should be giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote, and reasons why we shouldn't be giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. So we should remain, the voting age should remain at the legal, or at the age of 18 as it is at present. It may be worth then jotting down some ideas. So you could maybe draw yourself a table. You could write for on one side and against on the other, and then jot down some ideas on obviously both sides of this debate. Again, one of the key skills here that we do in politics is obviously we look at evidence, we look at things from a balanced point of view. So we must always look at the reasons for and against, but then we use that to come to an informed judgment. So as you're going through and obviously completing this activity, do start to think about your opinion and which side you would take, whether you think for or against. So hopefully now, having completed that reading, you should have a clear judgment, a clear opinion on whether or not you think 16 or 17-year-olds should be allowed to vote. With that judgment, if you would obviously open the form, obviously by clicking on the link, could you then answer the question on the form? So obviously answering whether or not you think 16-year-olds should be allowed to vote, or whether you think it should remain at 18. If you can then write an answer to that question, remembering obviously to support your answer with some of the knowledge, some of the reading obviously that you have just done, and then think about justifying your reasoning. So you must obviously explain and develop your opinion and your judgment, saying why you think 16-year-olds should or should not be allowed to vote. Thank you very much for obviously taking the time to complete these activities in this session, and I hope obviously it has been enjoyable, and I hope it has been useful in helping you to decide whether you think A-level politics might be for you. If you can then just do, I just have one final reflection before obviously logging off. If you can just think about perhaps what can we learn about the activities that you've completed, thinking about votes at 16. What does that tell us about politics in the UK? So you might want to refer back to your earlier definitions on politics to help you sort of answer that question. Please do make sure obviously you submit the form obviously with your views on whether or not votes at 16 should happen, or whether you think it should remain at 18. And I look forward to receiving some of your responses and to read obviously your varied opinions. My email address is there up on the screen, so if you do have any questions about the A-Level Politics course, please do get in contact and I'll do my best, obviously, to answer your queries. And I should look forward to seeing you next year if obviously you do choose A-Level Politics.